if I could now call the representatives of the Institute of Public Affairs to the table.
Thank you.
Welcome. If I could ask you both to just record your name and the capacity in which you are appearing here today for the Hansard.
Morgan Begg, the Director of the Legal Rights Program at the Institute of Public Affairs.
Daniel Weil, Deputy Executive Director of the Institute of Public Affairs.
Thank you. In looking through your material, just a point of clarification, would it be fair to say that you do not believe in climate change and that's why you don't think we should be taking action? Or is it that you believe that the planet is warming but that the actions we're taking are not accurate or appropriate?
Firstly, could I just ask permission to have photography undertaken?
Oh, sorry, yes.
Is that okay?
Can I just check with my colleagues?
Yeah.
Yeah, we okay with that?
Just
Thank
get my
you.
good side.
Thank you. Great. Thanks. And to begin with, I was hoping the opportunity to make a brief introductory remarks, if that's okay. So if I'll do that first and then get to your questions.
Easy.
Thank you. Well, again, thank you for the opportunity to appear before the committee today. I'll just wait for that music. Thank you. I'd like to make some brief remarks on the research that we have undertaken on the economic, social and humanitarian consequences of legislating a net zero target by 2050. The policy of net zero will impose significant and irreparable economic and social damage across Australia, with regional Australia most affected. IPA research has shown that under net zero, at a minimum, all coal, oil and gas projects in the construction pipeline will need to be cancelled. This will come at the cost of at least $274 billion in lost economic output, around 14% of Australia's annual GDP, and will cancel close to 500,000 jobs. The biggest impact will be felt in North and Central Queensland and the Hunter Valley. North Queensland could see up to 125,000 jobs cancelled, which is the equivalent to around 25 years' worth of local job creation. Net zero, which the legislation before us codifies, risks further driving up already rising electricity prices for families and small businesses. Under net zero, at a minimum, a further 6 large coal-fired power stations are scheduled to close by the year 2030. These stations currently generate approximately 1/5 of all energy supply on the national energy market. Our research identifies that this could, by 2030, more than quadruple annual wholesale electricity prices and more than double annual retail electricity prices. In addition to the cost to Australian families and businesses, the government's net zero target, which they are seeking to legislate, will mean more red tape and expense through court costs and delays to critical natural resources projects. As the legislation before us stands, net zero targets and the goals of the Paris Climate Agreement would become, quote, relevant considerations that a minister would need to take into account when making an approval decision. Section 5 of the Administrative Decisions Judicial Review Act allows a person to challenge a ministerial decision as an improper exercise of power if the minister fails to, quote, take a relevant consideration into account in the exercise of a power, end quote. This, combined with Section 487 of the EPBC Act, which extends legal standing to environmental groups to challenge projects, would mean environmental activists could be able to challenge any carbon-emitting project on the basis that the minister failed to consider how that project could contribute to or detract from the meeting of the legislated net zero targets of this proposed bill. Relatedly, I would like to refer to senators to Section 10, subsections 4, 5 and 6.
Can I just stop you for a moment?
Of course.
We only have half an hour. Most of what you're providing to us is in your submission. To allow senators to ask questions, can you keep it a little shorter?
Of course. I would just conclude by
great.
saying sections 4, 5 and 6 contain a ratchet clause that allows Parliament to increase emissions targets allows the government to increase those targets without approval or debate in Parliament, whereas reducing or repealing those targets would require separate legislation. The last point that I would like to make goes to the definition of net zero itself. What is net zero emissions by 2050? According to the explanatory memorandum of the bill, net zero means, quote, a balance between anthropogenic emissions by sources and removals by sinks of greenhouse gases, end quote. If net zero is the goal, it's unclear why only anthropogenic activity is included. Let me finish by referencing analysis by Professor Ian Plimer. Professor Plimer has identified if we include anthropogenic and natural sources of sequestration, Australia is already at net zero. Not only are we at net zero, according to Professor Plimer, we are at net zero 5 times over. Yet this or any other meaningful facet of net zero is not debated. Australians have not had the opportunity to adjudicate as to whether or not they believe the policy of net zero is in their interests or in the national interest. Both sides of politics took the same policy to the last election, depriving Australians of the opportunity to have their voice
Mr.
heard.
Wald, I'm going to remind you again that we have a short period of time. What you were telling us is all in your submissions. You are very welcome to table that, but I know that the senators have questions for you.
Of course. Well, please proceed with your questions.
Senator McKenzie?
Okay. Thank you, gentlemen. Could you please outline one of the risks of legislating a target? When we look at the UK, where other targets have been legislated, we've seen an increase in lawfare, the third runway at Heathrow, etc., environmental groups taking the government to court. We see that this target will apply to a specific number of government agencies. Can you outline some of your concerns that this may have for infrastructure pipelines and the like?
Well, our headline concern is exactly as you identify, Senator. This will result in significant more red tape and court delays to major projects across the country by embedding the net zero goals in legislation. That could require relevant ministers to take that into account as to whether or not they give approval to that project. And under the current legal standing provisions, as you know, green groups are able to challenge ministerial projects, ministerial approvals in court if they consider the unlawful consideration to have been given. Did you want to elaborate on that?
Well, we heard from a lot of the environmental NGOs yesterday, and I specifically asked them each individually whether they would guarantee that they would not be taking this federal government or future federal governments to court over much needed critical infrastructure projects as a result of legislating this target. And they could not give me that guarantee. So have you done any modelling on what that potentially could cost in terms of jobs, time and taxpayers' dollars?
What we have looked at is 19 projects which were the target of 2 green groups who wrote to the Environment Minister asking the Environment Minister to reconsider approvals which had already been given to those 19 resources projects around Australia, and we see those as the first cabs off the rank and a clear indication of the intent of those green groups. And as per our research which was released yesterday on that matter, the total economic cost would be in order of around $101 billion. Approximately 175,000 jobs put at risk. And again, 14 of those 19 projects in North Queensland and all of those projects in regional communities. So the economic costs are very significant, and the flow-on social and humanitarian costs of that widespread job loss could be irreparable and very damaging to those communities. Morgan, perhaps you could elaborate on the specific lawfare component of our research?
It's worth mentioning that it's not speculative. You did refer to one case in the United Kingdom. Another case in the United Kingdom was Stevenson and the Secretary of Housing, I believe, where an individual did challenge the government on an approval, and the court did agree that the government needed to consider a legislated net zero target as part of its decision-making process. There's similarly cases in New Zealand which have, because they've also legislated a net zero target. It's an emerging area of law, and only a few countries have legislated a net zero target, but the UK, New Zealand, and now Canada, there's increasing amounts of lawfare in that jurisdiction as well. And these are, in terms of being common law countries, these are very compatible, very influential precedents that I would feel that Australian courts would be persuaded to follow.
I mean, you made comment in your opening remarks about both sides of politics having a net zero position. The difference being one had a flexible pathway and a non-legislative pathway. The very act of legislating a target, which is the bill before us today, significantly increases risk, it would seem, for government itself. Did you have any comment to make around what amendments could be moved, or for those who think, this is an emerging area of law, why haven't other countries such as Germany, France, et al. Legislated? Because the government won the election, obviously. They've changed the NDC to their election commitment. They're well within their rights to do that. We're a democracy. But the act of legislating just seems to be adding additional sovereign risk to taxpayer spends. Why haven't other countries legislated? They've just updated their Paris target as they're able to do.
Well, it's a good observation. I think you're right. It does add to sovereign risk, and the legislation of the target embeds that in law, which then opens up the potential court proceedings. So that's the main concern from a legislative target perspective. Look, our view on this and our position is that the bill should be scrapped wholesale. The only way to safeguard our economy, our society, regional communities, and to avoid any potential lawfare or litigation from green groups is to simply scrap the policy of net zero emissions by 2050 in recognition of all those very significant costs that I've previously outlined.
Thank you, Will. I might take a follow-up question first. Given that we already have international obligations that we've signed up to take action on climate change, why would this legislation impose any greater burden?
Well, the first is, as I just mentioned, in terms of the potential litigation component to it.
But surely, given that we're nationally committed, the government has signed up that would place us in a similar situation.
Signing on to the Paris Agreement, that is a treaty. It's not, that doesn't mandate or cause any sort of obligation in terms of domestic policy. So what this bill is actually codifying the instrument through which the executive can sign on to and amend its commitments to the Paris Agreement. So the Paris Agreement, the treaty alone does not cause any sort of meaningful legal consequences, but by legislating it, that does put it into the bedrock of Australian law.
And the other point I'd just quickly add is, I think it was in 2015 when we signed on to the Paris Climate Agreement, the IPA was very clear that the Paris Climate Agreement was not in our national interest and that we shouldn't have signed up. And we've argued with our research and our analysis ever since that we should be withdrawing from the Paris Climate Agreement and not enmeshing ourselves and undermining our sovereignty by embedding our emissions policies and having that influenced by international organisations.
So perhaps I can go back to my first question, which do you believe that climate change is real and feel that that we should not take action, or do you not believe that the planet is warming and therefore don't believe we should take action?
Of course, climate change is real. Climate changes all the time and has been since time immemorial and will continue to do so. The issue that's before us today is the policy of the government, which is legislating net zero by 2050 and a 43% cut by 2030. The first point that I make is the costs of this and who will pay, how much they will pay in our community need to be discussed, and they haven't been debated. And the key point here, as I mentioned before, is that Australians have not been given the opportunity to have their voices heard. We know that almost every single major institution in our society has had an opportunity to have their voices heard. We know the big banks back in net zero. We know that big corporations back net zero. We know that the major international financial institutions back net zero. We know that the UN backs net zero. But why haven't Australians had a chance to have their voice heard on this issue, which is them that will be affected? It's not the inner city elites in Sydney or Melbourne and Brisbane. It's working class, middle class Australians in the outer suburbs and the regions that will pay the price, yet their values, their views, their aspirations are ignored by the political class.
There are those of us who would say that everyone had a chance to vote at the last election, even those people who don't live in the elite suburbs. I will just take you to one other point.
Just quickly on that though, because as I said, the policy, yes, everyone had the chance to vote, but they didn't have a chance to vote on the policy of net zero because both major parties had committed to net zero. Yes, I accept that there are differences in how both parties said that they would aim to get to net zero, but we have not had the opportunity to have a clear election on whether or not Australians want the policy of net zero. And I'll just add, when we ask Australians, do you want net zero? They don't. We ask, do you want to pause the policy of net zero as what happened in the United Kingdom? 61% of Australians said, yes, we want to pause the policy of net zero emissions. So when we ask Australians, it's very clear that they don't support the policy of net zero. And it's disappointing that the political class doesn't want to garner the views or listen to the voices of mainstream Australians.
And I would just point out, Mr. Wild, that there are many other polls that say the exact opposite from what yours does, and I think it's probably that point of disagreement about whether people have had their say. I will just very finally, because we have a short period of time, we need to get to other senators. I will just say it is my understanding that 150 countries have announced net zero. 18 of them have legislated net zero, and 19 have proposed legislation, which is a higher number than what you were talking previously.
Okay, but
we will now go to Senator Hughes.
That bears no relevance as to whether or not it's in our national interest to do so.
No, but you were citing some numbers, so I'm just giving you the numbers that I'm aware of.
I said a small number of countries, which I don't think is inconsistent with what
18 out of 150 is a small number.
It's a pathway to progress. Senator Hughes.
Thank you, Chair. If I can bring you, Mr. Wild, you mentioned the Ratchet clause in your opening statement. What sort of impact could that have on Australia's sovereignty, and what? We'll start with that one and go from there. So,
perhaps I'll address that. So, the combined impact of clauses 10.4, 10.5, and 10.6 is that the executive will be given the authority to amend its nationally determined contribution to the Paris Agreement, but that it can only increase its commitment. It can only be more ambitious. But to wind back that commitment or to abandon that commitment altogether would require a separate piece of legislation. This is a problem. It is essentially granting the executive a lawmaking power because its determination about the nationally determined contribution would change the content of law and would have serious legal consequences, as we've outlined. The other
so you're saying the government of the day could just go, well, we've legislated 43%, but we've changed our mind, we're going to go to 65%.
Yeah, exactly, and that wouldn't require a public debate.
They could just decide, or we've got to negotiate a piece of legislation with the Greens. So therefore, we said 43%, but we might just go to 55 now because the Greens are happier with that, and we need this other piece of legislation on a completely separate matter.
Base political reason. It could be for any reason. So
okay.
Yep.
So the Australian people wouldn't get a say then. They've agreed to 43%, but we might want to negotiate. Completely separate piece of legislation, so we'll give the Greens an extra couple of percentage points.
Yeah, that's right. So just to reiterate, the legislation does not legislate the target, it legislates the mechanism by which the target is set and gives that power to the executive to decide what that target
takes it away from the Australian people having a democratic say.
It's fundamentally an anti-democratic measure.
Yeah, okay. So just
allowable instrument though?
I think you find that the target can be set without legislation. The idea of the legislation is to provide certainty, clarity and transparency.
And 43% is a floor.
If you want, just on the point of certainty, why not legislate 0%? That would give certainty as well. So this is not a
because that's not a target we agree with. It's
not a question of certainty. It's
it is because so people are clear about where we're going.
Sectional interest that you're buttressing with government authority. If we want certainty, we can have certainty with any number. So let's not
That's
pretend,
right.
Let's
And
not
that's the
pretend this is
importance.
about certainty
So it's not about 43%. It's about allowing the executive to set a number whenever they want,
without having debate.
without having debate,
Because they know
and
full now-
taking the power away from the people, putting it in the hands of the legislators and the executive. So it's not about 43% at all. It's about a
The
mechanism
power to
that
set that
allows.
target sits there already.
No, but it's
with
not
or
about
without the
40.
legislation.
Can I have my questions, please?
Yes,
Because
you
it's
may.
not about 43%. It's about putting a legislative mechanism in to just say the executive can just pick a number, whatever they feel like, whenever they feel like. So it's not really even providing that certainty, because businesses may invest to hit a 43% emissions reduction, but because they need another piece of legislation, they need the Greens, they need Senator Pocock or whoever, we've actually gone up to 55% now. So your investment strategy is no longer
The
appropriate.
target could change with less than a day's notice.
Yeah, okay, right. So when you also mentioned there that there could be issues with international organisations now being able to influence what Australia's targets are. And looking at the global situation at the moment, we've got German Greens backing coal back in, we've got China opening more power stations than we've got in total. This is a global issue. Somehow or other, there's some people in this place that seem to think it's only Australia's problem to solve, and economically tying our hand behind our back when we have some of the best coal in the world, and the rest of the world is crying out for it. Yet we're demanding to shut down one of our most lucrative industries, supporting rural and regional Australians in particular, but all Australians through the revenue that it generates in economic activity. What are the international organisations, or what are the threats that international organisations could have now through this legislative mechanism on Australia's sovereignty and our ability to compete on the world stage, let alone support everyday Australians, keep the lights on?
Well, I might make one point on the international organisations. So, as you know, this bill would embed the goals of the Paris Climate Agreement. So, Section 10.2 says the emissions targets are, quote, to be interpreted in a manner with the Paris Climate Agreement, end quote. Now, it's worth looking at what the actual Paris Climate Agreement says. And as Morgan identified, this would mean judges would now be in the position of considering whether a minister has considered whether projects uphold the values and principles of the Paris Climate Agreement. Well, what are those principles? Well, climate integrity, Mother Earth, international equity. These are the kinds of notions and principles that are in the Paris Agreement. So again, this potentially opens up the possibility that whether or not a project affects Mother Earth could be a relevant consideration in the minister making a decision. So the potential scope for inserting these international organisational values into Australia is very significant, and it's an emerging issue for us.
Things like the Inland Rail.
Look, anything that is carbon emitting project could fall within the remit of environmental groups to challenge projects because of how that project might impact the commitment to net zero. So anything that emits is on the hit list.
So anything using steel or concrete.
Yes.
Any road, any bridge, any rail project.
It's all now
In our
risk of
$120
litigation.
billion infrastructure project pipeline.
It's all in scope. It's all in scope. And
I
the key
hope
thing
you
is,
like those gravel roads out there and get flooded out. So I just want to be just uber clear before I finish, just so that everyday Australians out there might understand this. This is not about legislating 43%. This is about giving power to the executive to pick a number on any day of the week that they feel is the emissions target Australians should strive for. So it's not about business certainty. It's not going to provide that certainty because they could change from 43% on a whim if they need to negotiate something through the Senate.
That is correct, and that is
So
literally
Australians
what the
need to understand this
legislation
isn't
spells out.
legislating 43%. This is legislating power to the executive to set a target whenever, however they feel like.
well, the other point is that
about that this week.
Yeah.
the target can only go up.
Yep.
That's the other point.
Yep.
So it can't come down. So if there was any future government that wanted to reduce or repeal these targets,
Yep.
they'd require separate legislation, as they should do.
Yep.
Our point is quite simply, if you're going to legislate a target, which you shouldn't do anyway, but if you are going to legislate a target, the normal parliamentary process should be followed for increases or decreases to those targets.
That's got nothing to do with the science. It's all about the politics now.
I'll take that as a comment from you, if that's okay.
I think you can take that as a comment. That's fine.
Maybe the last 10
Thanks,
years
Chair.
were all about politics as well.
Well, I think it's going to continue to be about politics because apparently now we're not allowed laughing gas when we're in Labor because the carbon emissions have knocked us too much. No, I kid you not. The Greens in South Australia are trying to
Okay,
ban
can we have some order?
laughing
Who
gas
would like the
through
call
Labor.
to ask a question of our witnesses?
I'll send you the article.
Anybody?
It's great. Adelaide
No,
University.
nobody has any
Hilarious.
questions? Okay. Senator Mackenzie.
Gentlemen, some more questions. In terms of, the legislating of the target, I understand your arguments, Mr. Wild, but the election was held, the people had their say. They've elected a government that's changed our NDC to 43%. They've removed one of the key checks and balances that the Nationals were key in inserting into the Glasgow piece, which was a 5-yearly productivity commission review into the social and economic impacts of not just of any government over the next 28 years, climate policies, whether they were coalition or Labor Party, who was paying, who was hurting, so that governments could and the people could be informed. This government has removed that from our nationally determined contribution. They've amended it to have the Climate Authority to do a bit of a whiz through on the socio-economic impact. Can you, or Mr. Begg, give us some insight in what sort of checks and balances we need around these sort of policy settings to ensure that the Parliament and the people are rightfully informed about the impacts of climate policy going forward?
Yeah, I'll address that first. So I am quite concerned about the checks and balances angle that you've described. In particular, clauses 15 or 16 of the bill, which confers on the Climate Change Authority this responsibility to advise the minister in developing a new nationally determined contribution. I read that as a kind of legislated institutional mechanism to encourage higher targets over time. An interesting case, decision still pending in New Zealand actually, where an environmental group challenged the Climate Change Commission in that country on the basis that it violated the law because its recommendations for emissions cuts to the government were insufficient and incompatible with their targets under the Paris Agreement. So, and I see what I see for the Climate Change Authority being provided for in this bill is completely applicable to what's happening in New Zealand. I see that happening here as well. So over time, I think rather than checks and balances, you're getting institutions which are essentially encouraging the government to go further.
So would there be an agency in our current governance arrangements who would be much more appropriate to be doing that regular assessment rather than almost setting up a ratcheting mechanism as a result of this legislation?
I think your proposal, Senator Mackenzie, makes a lot of sense in terms of the Productivity Commission looking at these issues. And look, I'm terribly concerned what this is going to do to jobs around the country. We're consistently told that there'll be new jobs. Where are they? They're not there. The jobs aren't coming in. And I'll refer you even to the CSIRO report that came out recently as reported in the Australian Financial Review, which identified that in Queensland, up to a maximum of just 26,700 jobs would be needed to get to net zero by 2050 in Queensland. Now that's as a maximum, and as our research identified, there are around 125,000 jobs in the fossil fuel sector in North Queensland alone. So even on the CSIRO's most optimistic scenario, the job destruction is 6 times that of the job creation. So that when we talk about finding new jobs for the communities that are affected, the jobs aren't there, and the minuscule number of jobs that are there are low paying. They pay around a third less than the jobs that are being destroyed in coal mining and about 5% less than the economy-wide average. So the fundamental thing we need is for people to be honest with Australians about what this means for them. The jobs are not there, the jobs aren't coming back, and the communities that rely on these jobs are going to disappear.
Okay. Just on notice, can I have you to look very, very seriously at checks and balance mechanisms and provide us some advice back? Thank you.
Of course.
And I'll just wrap up with one final question. You were talking about us withdrawing from the Paris Agreement. Could you just very briefly outline how you think that would impact our foreign policy, our security interests in the Pacific particularly, and also in our trading relationships?
It would be a significant benefit to our security interests. The reason for that is we have an abundance of natural resources, so we have energy sovereignty. We have 2,000 years of coal, we have an abundance of oil and gas, we've got a third of the world's uranium deposits, and legislating the Paris Climate Agreement, given effect through net zero, risks outsourcing our energy sovereignty to foreign nations. 80% of our solar panels come from China, for example, and all we have to do is look at what is happening in Europe to see the devastating and serious impacts of what happens when a nation unilaterally and voluntarily outsources its energy supply to foreign nations. So withdrawing from the Paris Climate Agreement not only would regain Australia's competitive economic advantage on the world stage, not only would it reduce energy prices, but crucially, it would secure our domestic energy supplies, and that is of particular importance in the Asia-Pacific region now when it's such a volatile part of the world.
So you think us withdrawing from sort of foreign relations and international engagement on those areas would be of benefit to us?
I'm talking specifically about the Paris Climate Agreement, and I think absolutely yes, for all the reasons that I've outlined.
Okay, fascinating. Thank you. Thank you for your evidence today. Thank you for appearing. If you have taken any questions on notice, the date for return is Tuesday, the 23rd of August. I would now like to welcome our nuclear experts from the Australian Nuclear Association, Nuclear for Climate Australia and Gamma Energy Technology to come to the table or show themselves on the screen.